All right, everybody. Sorry about a late live show. Had some errands to run. We got Blake back here. He's gonna be hopping on in a second, so you'll see him on the other camera as well. That being said, today's topic is a topic where a lot of people are going to wonder what's actually going on here. Because one of the things I've noticed when I've looked into socionics and I've looked into MBTI specifically is what I'm seeing is the aspect of how socionics doesn't actually transfer to MBTI. You go to a lot of these websites, and the websites have things like, oh, ENFJ equals ENFJ, ENFP equals ENFP. See, this particular perspective is really it's like a misnomer almost, because what you do is you're looking at a particular perspective and trying to translate over, but what you actually recognize is the cognitive functions aren't the same at all, and that's what creates a problem for a lot of people who are involved in MBTI or socionics. Is they're trying to translate, they're coming from one end to or another end, and that creates a big challenge. So there's this issue with socionics and MBTI translation. There's going to be a lot of people argue with this. They're going to say, no, it's a smooth translation if as long as you understand the functions. It's really not. As far as I've seen, as far as everything else I've seen, it's not the case. One thing I can say about MBTI is when we start looking at the functions of MBTI, the cognitive functions, which are called information elements in socionics. Information elements is the same thing as the MBTI cognitive functions. The only difference is that the functions actually have different definitions. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually look at starting out to understand the information elements. What you have to do is you have to understand what the information elements are in socionics in comparison to the cognitive functions in MBTI. Both are founded on Jungian psychology, of course, but I would say that socionics improved the original idea of what these functions are and the translation of it, rather. So they've added to it, made it make more sense. And as I've done more research, I'm identifying the sense that it makes. So y'all are waiting for this, so let's start with this. So one thing I want to start with, I've got a few notes here. I'm going to kind of guide this conversation a little bit because as I've mentioned before, I am fairly new to socionics. I can't call myself a socionist. I just am a hobbyist who studies this stuff because I really enjoy teaching, and I enjoy helping people try to find their way and navigate through complex information in a more simple manner. So, sure, there's a lot of things I may say, which down the road I may correct myself. Just giving you a disclaimer. So let's start off with the point of logic. So socionics calls extroverted thinking extroverted logic. It's annotated with a P, standing for pragmatism. If we understand logic in the sense of how it works in MBTI, we understand it's extroverted, introverted. We understand that the extroverted logic is about orders, hierarchies, rules, structures, systems, that type of thing. And that's what creates the perspective of extroverted thinking in MBTI. It's not like this in socionics. Socionics, there's everything is already perception. It's information metabolism. This is already a difference between MBTI and socionics, is that you're metabolizing information, kind of like food. You're taking in carbohydrates, fats, protein, whatever. In socionics, you're actually taking in this information and metabolizing it in a different way, depending on what function it fits. So socionics has a function model called Model A, and that's kind of the whole concept of where socionics is in the Model A concept. So what happens is you insert information elements into the model where the functions are. They're called functions in socionics. This can get really confusing because you naturally think the functions are the MBTI functions, and that's not the case. The functions are the slots. They're like empty. If you think about a computer, like a RAM slot on your motherboard, that's kind of like you insert the information element and it has a particular performance based on where it is in the function model. Okay, so the information element is the cognitive function in MBTI. The functions in socionics doesn't exist in MBTI other than dominant, auxiliary, tertiary, and inferior. So a little bit of different translation there. That being said, it's hard to make a smooth transition over. You can roughly say it's closest to this type, but there are some very, very distinct differences between, say, ISFP and MBTI and ISFJ in socionics. Obviously, that translates to ISFP and MBTI, but the problem is it really doesn't. There's issues here. And this is just one example. There's many examples that this is the case. All right, back to information metabolism. As we were talking about objects, the logic is about objects in socionics. It's about essence and relations and understanding the relationships between the objects, okay? So one is the essence, it's the structure. It's what makes that particular thing that particular thing. For example, if we think about a table, it has legs, right? We think a table has legs. Can a table not have legs? maybe, right? What makes it a table? How do we know when we look at something that it's a table? Because we inherently perceive some type of structure. So this is essential. This is the essence of black logic. I'm sorry, black logic. And this is called extroverted thinking, is understanding the structure of objects, right? So this is the Socionics definition. It's not about enforcing hierarchy. It's not about pushing an agenda. It's not about achieving goals necessarily. This can obviously be taken to a whole nother level when it comes to business and business logic, but we're talking about very, very basic fundamentals of what it is in socionics. Okay, so objects. We also know that there's space between objects, physical space. Okay, and we know that from object A, object B, there's space. We also know there's energy. All right, objects move. What moves them is energy. How do we move them? That's the energy component in socionics. And then there's time. Okay, and each of these particular aspects of perception, all information, and these socionics has the rule of thumb that these pieces of information are actually the basic foundational structure of all things in which you can perceive. Okay, so that's the key to understand it in socionics.
Whoa.
Well, Blake, that was good information.
Great information.
All right, so that being said, you can see that the information is there's that basic fundamental aspect of socionics, which is that's all the information in which you can see and perceive. It's objects, space, energy, and time. Okay, how do you perceive time? Well, you know that an object moves. You know that things happen over a period. You know that an object changes places. You know that thing, and that's how you're starting to perceive time. Now, when you look at these particular models of perception, you break them down again into essence and relational, right? So if we look at objects, this creates extroverted logic and introverted logic. And the essence is going to be your extroversion that's associated with MBTI. So if you're making this translation, look at extroversion, okay? When you look at essence, extroversion, structure, extroversion. What makes it? Right. So when you look at this particular aspect, you start seeing what makes this a particular structure. So again, when we go back to the table, what makes it a table? How do we know this table is a table? What classifies it as a table? So you can see now that TE and MBTI is starting to look like TI. I'm sorry, TE is in socionics is starting to look like TI and MBTI. It's starting to have this crossover where you're starting to recognize, oh, that sounds like TI. It's starting to be classifying criteria. But this is only objects. Right. So some of the common questions in MBTI is, like SE. I'm going to kind of change gears and then I'm going to go right back. So bear with me. But SE, we all look at SE and we go in MBTI and we say SE is the perception of the world. As we experience life, we experience it as is. This puts us in more touch with our surroundings and helps us be able to make tangible decisions in the moment. Similar to SE in socionics, but a little different at the same time, because the SE here is more focused on perception. Whereas in socionics, the entire backbone of all things in which you can perceive, logic is perception. This is where you get into more of these Rhinean dichotomies, because now it's not about perception, it's about rational and irrational, right? You have two sides of this. It's not about perception and about judgment per se, okay? Now, there is judgment and perception, but it gets very complicated from there. We're not talking about that particular topic today. We're going to talk about specifically how these things are no longer about, because there's a lot of people who get far enough in MBTI where they go, well, how does NI actually filter information? Because it has to make some type of judgment. This is an unanswered question in the MBTI arena as far as the cognitive theory goes. NI filters information on its own. It processes on its own. So it's making judgment on what can be discarded, eliminating possibility. But if you understand this from the socionic perspective, it actually makes sense because it's not perception in the way that we're perceiving it in socionics. So this is what's creating the dichotomy of where you're getting this mix mash when you try to translate systems, because now you're translating, it's like translating one language into a type of food. It doesn't even really mesh as well anymore. Yeah, you're still in typology. You're still in, trying to classify a type of person, yes. But you can't translate something of this substance, which is found on the backbone that everything is in the sense of what we already perceive, which is object, space, and energy, and time. Those are all perception. So if you're looking at it from an MBTI lens and you're going, I'm looking at this particular mode of perception and I'm seeing MBTI in the sense of okay, which function is actually perceiving objects, which function is perceiving space, which function is perceiving energy, and which function is perceiving time. Okay. Now the MBTI person will say, well, that's all SE because you're perceiving, or that's all NE because you're perceiving, or that's NI because you're perceiving, or SI because you're perceiving. But it doesn't work like that in Socionics because all this is already perception. Okay, so if we can start understanding that, we can understand the complication when it comes to try to transfer. So like I said in the other previous videos that we've mentioned about Socionics, it's best to start from scratch. This way you don't have to try to, now all of us who are trying to make sense of it all want it all kind of to fit together like a smooth puzzle, but what you come to recognize is they're very different. And trying to mesh them is not the easiest thing on the planet. That's why you have people who are anti-MBTI, and that's why you have people who are anti-Socionics.
Well, I totally get it now. Why people are because they're so set in their ways. Because, like, it's so hard to grasp Socionics. You know, just learning about MBTI for me right now, because I'm like still trying to think in MBTI terms when I just totally need to separate myself from that brain and start from scratch.
Right, exactly. That's kind of where we are with the process. So I've been talking to people on Slack. If you haven't joined our Slack, by the way, hop on. But I've been talking to people on Slack, and they're like, "Well, what does my type translate? I'm an INFP in MBTI. Does that make me an EII in Socionics?" Well, maybe it doesn't. You know, like, and it really gets kind of complicated because none of these are the same. I've looked at these functions. I've spent all day looking at them. I've spent all day, and you know, I'm a relatively quick learner, so I look at this stuff and I go, okay, if you look clearly at the definitions, SE is a good example. SE in Socionics is about force and application of force. Why? Because the perception of space and its essence, its structure, the boundaries created are limited by space, right? So space has a boundary. How do we know when space ends and object begins? Is looking at SE. You see the essence, the structure of space, right? So naturally, to alter or to things take space, SE is the information metabolism saying that something is either infringing on my space or I need to create space. So this is not SE in Socionics, which is just perception, right? So the SE is different. So you'll see this quite a bit in the changeover, that you can't possibly be ISFP and MBTI and not something else in Socionics, because that may not be SE for you. Right. So this is where the MBTI stereotypes come from when it comes to the artist, right? The ISFs, they're artists. They're beautiful artists because they're really sensory, right? They like to paint their little pictures and they like to look at their little whatever it may be. And so, or ESFPs or ESTPs are sports. They love sports because they're really perceiving their environment, right? You know, I've went through a lot of this, and I just think it's ridiculous to think that the only people that play sports are ESPs. That's insane. Now, granted, you have people who are good at perception in general. I don't obviously prefer ESP and MBTI. Yet I've trained my entire life as a martial artist. I'm very sensory aware. I'm aware when people kind of enter my space. Again, I'm aware of what's going on in my environment. I'm not clueless. I'm not lost in space. I'm very aware. More aware than a lot of people who are ESFPs. I guess I could be mistyped in MBTI because my SE is good, quote unquote, right? That's where the translation is. So what I'm saying is, don't try to translate this. Start from scratch. Start like a new system, a new theory. And if you can do that, you're going to save yourself a lot of headache. And you don't really have to try to bounce back and forth. Like I said, I'm going to catch a lot of flack. Some of you are going to be like, oh yeah, it's smoothly translate. You clearly don't understand the functions. I get that. And I'm openly admitting I don't have a full understanding of everything. I don't even have a full understanding of MBTI. It's just a process in which we're learning things, in which we move forward. So with that being said, we understand that the baseline of Socionics is understanding that only 4 types of information can really be received. 4 types of perception: objects, space, energy, time. And then those break down into their structures and then the relationships between each other. So when we look at SI, it's the relationship between what? 2 objects. It's space, right? Blake, did you want to add?
No.
Okay. So yeah, so space between two particular objects. That's it. So you have that aspect of space. And that's what creates, you start seeing the relationship between these 2, right? So when you think of an SI user in Socionics, it's going to be much different than someone who uses SI and MBTI. Where SI and MBTI is, I've seen it poorly defined as remembering past experiences. That's not the
Yeah, sorry. That's how I usually define it. So And I think that's a common misconception. I mean, I've seen more thorough explanations of SI. I just feel like that's, the best explanation. But what is the right explanation of it?
Right. Yeah. And so you'll see that a lot of people are saying it's remembering past experiences. Well, SI is not directly linked with memory. I have probably the best memory of everybody I've ever met, as far as that goes. Now, I don't have the best memory in the world, but I have a pretty good memory as far as recall. I can recall a lot of things. When I was a kid, I'd remember everybody's credit card numbers, driver's license numbers, everything. All that stuff came to me really well. Does that make me a dominant SI user? No, it doesn't. So SI, we understand it to be the comparison of archetypes is what it is. It's looking at a past concrete archetype in MBTI. Then there's nothing wrong with this definition. The problem is that Socionics and MBTI share the same words, SI, right? That's where the confusion creates. There's nothing wrong with the definition in MBTI. I'm not knocking MBTI. I'm just explaining that it's a different definition for different things, but the same words. The semantics are the same. So when you have two people on Slack arguing about what SI is, we get into this, which theory are you using? So that's where the complexity arises, because we're looking at these two different theories and we're trying to argue from a different theoretical standpoint. It's better off, if you're going to argue which one works better as MBTI or Socionics, is to argue at a theory level versus argue at a cognitive function level, because you're not going to find a point of agreement there. The way to resolve any kind of, or to win any argument, is to have a point where your opponent says, you know what, you're right? That's the objective. They agree, they see your perspective. They're not going to do that if they're thinking SI is this way. And some people call a pig a sow, right? I mean, it's the same kind of thing. You have this issue where you're using the same word for two different things. So if we can understand this, we start recognizing that particular issue, and we can actually move past it versus trying to convert it. So remove the conversion, start from scratch, and understand how information metabolism works in Socionics, understanding that the 4 types of information that we're taking in: object, space, energy, time, right? And if you want to correlate this, objects is logic, space is your sensation, okay? Energy is focused on your emotions, not just emotions, that's more of the structure, but the relationships too. So this is your feeling, okay? So energy is relation to feeling. This gets really cool because we talked about spirituality, we talked about vibrational energy. If you watch the Preston Smiles, Alexi Panos interview, they talked about vibrational energy. Socionics has this core understanding that we all emit an energy, a vibrational energy. All right. So energy is associated with emotion. No surprise, right? Our emotion has a vibrational energy. So you can see how this all kind of connects. Ultimately, you can see the energy that's associated with it. So that's really cool. You can see that aspect, that particular part that's pertaining to that. Then you have time, right? Time is your intuition, the perception of time. Okay, now that breaks down into the essence, the structure of time, okay, and the relational aspect. Now I can't get into every function today because this can get really, really long and drawn out. Blake is here, so we're going to be doing some serious production videos on each one of these particular information elements. And then we'll talk more about the functions of the particular Model A as well. So we'll move through each function. So the question is, I'm going to take a second. I'm going to let Blake say anything if he needs to. I'm going to check out the chat to make sure that you guys don't have any questions before I move forward into anything. So
last time I checked, there's really nothing in the chat, but I am I'm just going to have the mindset of a student, be a sponge at this point. And if you're learning about MBTI right now and you're suddenly just going to jump on Socionics, you got to be the same way. You got to be that sponge. Kind of start over, and I thought that was pretty interesting that about the vibrational frequencies that Socionics has that element within it. It's going to be interesting going forward, learning more about this.
Perfect. So that being said, guys, let's break this down. So what is we look at logic, we look at an object, and we looked at the essence of that object. That kind of really defines the extroverted portion, okay? What the structure of that. We also look at the relationship between that object. So this is where TE and TI are mixed up in Socionics. When you have, and I don't want to say that all TE users in MBTI are TI users in Socionics. That's not true either. But this is where there's a common confusion, because there's a lot of understanding that TE and MBTI is about structure and order, which is true in MBTI. But if you try to translate that over, you actually start finding out that it's actually more TI in Socionics. And it's because you're looking at the relationship between objects. Do you see how this, if you're looking at the relationships between objects, you can start seeing how these two things are structured, right? You can start seeing how these two things actually come together. And you start saying, okay, I can actually bring these two together and create a general law, a general principle off of this. And now I'm going to enforce this principle. All right, so you have this particular TISE aspect. SE is that force. It's the force. I'm going to now enforce this because that's a principle in which I believe. But then there's other TE users in socionics that they're more about pragmatists, right? As Jack defined, it's integrity seeking versus clarity seeking, which is a huge turning point for me when he clarified those things for me and identified, okay, you know, there's this aspect, integrity seeking and, you know, clarity seeking. They both have this perspective, and we've defined that in other videos. And so going back to that aspect is, do you prefer more of integrity seeking or do you prefer more clarity seeking? And then you're probably thinking, well, I do both. That's true. But if you do both, there's probably one or two in which you don't connect with. So for integrity seeking, it's TEFI, right? It's TEFI in Socionics. Let's drop MBTI real quick. It's TEFI in Socionics. Whereas clarity seeking is TIFE in Socionics. So you may go, well, I kind of see both. If you read the descriptions, it's on World Socionics website. Just type in World Socionics Society, and you're going to see the definitions on that website. So check that out. That's Jack's website. It's well written, great resource in some of the studying I've done. So check that out when you get the opportunity, and join that Facebook group because there's a lot of good content in there as well. So that being said, yeah, so you can see that you're going, well, I kind of have aspects of both. But what you don't have, there's one on there that you're going to not connect with. So you may connect to the logical side of integrity seeking if you prefer clarity seeking, but then you'll have a struggle with the integrity seeking feeling side. You'll go, oh, I don't relate to the relational aspect of that. So then that means overall, you still have an overall preference of, you know, clarity seeking versus integrity seeking. So when we understand the Model A, when you understand how this works, the demonstrative function, which is the opposite attitude of your MBTI auxiliary function, or it's the opposite attitude of your creative function, right, is actually your strongest function, along with your leading function. These two functions are your strongest function, your leading function and your demonstrative function. So for example, if we understand the MBTI type of, let's say, let's go with the ENTJ. All right, so we understand the MBTI type of the ENTJ. The dominant and the creative are the same as the dominant and auxiliary in MBTI. So the dominant and the creative are the same. So we have the creative is NI in Socionics. So the demonstrative is NE, which means that the ENTJ's NE is actually stronger than the ENTJ's NI, but it's subdued. It's not valued. Okay, so it's demonstrative. That's called the eighth function in Socionics. And if we understand this, we start getting to a perspective of going, okay, why is it stronger since it's not valued? It's because that's how the cognitive psyche is wired. If you understand Model A, you understand how it actually has more strength. It's called a fourth dimensional function. There's dimensions, which I'm not going to get into today either, but there's dimensions which kind of gauge this level of strength or capacity of the information element in Socionics. Okay, so they gauge that, and there's 4 dimensions. And you can understand that the dimensions in which they're used. That every information element has the first dimension, which is experience. You experience it because we talked about that. If you look at the MBTI and you look at SE, if you don't have SE in your stack, you can automatically assume that you don't know where a wall is, right? Because you're not perceiving reality anymore, or you're not perceiving what is in front of you. And there's some of you that just are, you know, you're clumsy, you run into walls. Okay, there's some of you that do that, but that can't automatically, oh, you run into walls, you don't have SE. That's not how it works. Socionics, it's not like that. It's much more sophisticated. You start looking at it, okay, I do perceive objects, I do perceive space, I do perceive energy, and I do perceive time. And if you understand that, you understand that all information elements, all 8 of them have 1D, the first dimension, right? So the best way to pair this is SE in MBTI is closest to the measurement of strength in Socionics of the first dimension. Okay, so the SE doesn't translate to an information element. The MBTI SE doesn't transfer to an information element in Socionics. But I would say if you try to transfer it, it's probably closest to SI in Socionics. But even then, it's not worth even the correlation, because SI is the relation between 2 objects. It's not the perception that the objects are actually there. Okay, So if you're trying to translate SE over to Socionics, probably wouldn't go down that road. All right, let me pause for questions really quick. So let's see. Why can't I? Yeah, so I don't see any particular questions. So yeah, that being said, I want to make sure that you have that idea that don't try to translate SE. It's not easy to translate. Same thing with TE, TI. The TI in Socionics is a lot more like the structures and rules and hierarchies that is associated with TE. I will say that, interestingly enough, the TE and MBTI is overglorified. And I will profess this. I think it is overglorified. It contains aspects of Socionics TI, Socionics SE, Socionics NI, and even Socionics NE. Okay. So the power of TE and MBTI contains 4 features, not all the features of each information element, but 4 different information elements. It contains features of 4 information elements. You know, and that's to me is quite crazy to think about to classify as TE. So, for example, one of the things in MBTI is you see TE and it's about logical sequencing. It's cause and effect, right? So when you look at official MBTI work, what you're starting to recognize is that you see it says logical sequencing, cause and effect relationship, right? You can understand cause and effect. You can understand that a particular thing has there's a cause, a stimulus, and then there's a response. Here's what's going to happen. So imagine having kind of a powerhouse TE. You know that this particular thing is going to lead to this, to lead to this, lead to this. Now it looks like intuition and Socionics, right? So this is where people get ESTJ and ENTJ mixed up in MBTI because naturally TE users, according to MBTI, are able to look at cause and effect relationships. Okay. So you're starting to see this, oh man, I must be an NI user because I know that if I do this, logically, it's going to wind up in this. Makes logical sense, right? So this is where the issue is with TE and NI as far as MBTI goes. NI is different. NI is very different, and the systems. The closest function translation that's a pure translation, I would say, I think Jack agrees with me here as far as this goes. I would say that it's NE to NE. It's pretty similar. You know, I think that's a pretty smooth translation. So that's the one. If you're most likely, if you're ILE and Socionics, you're probably ENTP and MBTI. It's a pretty smooth translation. I wouldn't say that's the case for everybody, of course, but I would say it's probably a smooth one if you have that in either. You might wind up being an IEE, ENFP, but the idea is that NE is very similar, so you'll see that in your personality. But as far as the other functions go, I've created a graph. I haven't finished it or released it yet, but I've created a graph that translates the functions over, and it has like 18 different functions on there because some of the Socionics don't translate to MBTI, and some of the MBTI doesn't translate over to Socionics. So you've got this huge mix-up, and that's where the issue is, right? So I've had a lot of people ask me which one goes to which one goes to which, and then you start recognizing the confusion and the whole thing. Instead of just going, you know what, clear the slate. I'm nothing and nobody in Socionics. I have no 3 letters. I have not earned my 3 letters because I don't know what the heck I am, and that's a good place to be. Versus going, what am I in MBTI? And now I'm going to flip over. Because then you're going to take all your preconceived notions of MBTI and try to force it into a model in which it doesn't fit. Okay, so it's better just to clear the slate and recognize that you don't know anything. And that was the approach I had with it when I first talked to Jack, and I recognized that he had a lot of knowledge on Socionics. I said, wow, okay, I'm going to clear the slate. I kind of jumped into it, and I said, I'm going to clear the slate, and I'm going to recognize that I don't know anything about Socionics, and we'll see what happens. And it kind of created a lot of clarification for me in identifying, okay, now I'm seeing the purity of Socionics and versus trying the tarnished perspective I had, say, a year ago about Socionics, which was it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work because I never identified fully with the LIE description. I never did. I was like, okay, this doesn't make sense. This particular aspect doesn't make sense. I especially didn't understand the part of the dualities or the relationships. So I was trying to understand it from an MBTI perspective. I said, okay, ENTJ and MBTI, ISFP and MBTI, oh, that's a horrible relationship. And I just recalled, I was like, this is not going to work. So I just immediately discounted the whole relationship aspect. But if you start looking at information metabolism, you actually see the pairing is actually rather successful. And I don't mean all cases are successful. Still, maturity is a factor, but you start seeing how they complement particular sides. And some functions are willing to receive advice on a particular thing based on their position in model A, based on their function, right? The information element is willing to receive certain advice. The mobilizing function, which is your tertiary function in MBTI, is going to be the sixth function in Socionics. And that mobilizing function is actually a point where it's kind of weak, but at the same time, it has a little bit of an inferiority complex. And so, same with the suggestive function. And so the mobilizing function has a little bit of an inferiority complex, though. It's like, okay, I don't know how to handle this. And so there's a little bit of a defensiveness and a cockiness to it. Once you get a hang of it and you start getting a hang of that mobilizing function, you can get kind of carried away with it. Then you can be a little overzealous with it to the point where it kind of lets you down. And that's kind of the mobilizing role per se. And whereas the fourth and fifth function, which is your vulnerable and your suggestive, are the primary points of inferiority complexes that can be generated if they aren't valued, not by you, but by other people, or insulted or criticized. And the mobilizing function, like they say, there's a saying that says the mobilizing function is the point. If you want to piss a type off, you attack their mobilizing function. And so that's true. Now, if you attack their vulnerable function, they don't value the vulnerable function at all. So it's like, yeah, you're right. I don't care. I don't need that. That sucks. Who wants it? It's called the point of least resistance. They don't see a purpose for the vulnerable. But the mobilizing is a different story. The suggestive, on the other side, if you attack it or try to give advice to that particular portion, they're like, yeah, that's really good advice. They actually like it. And you can see how this works in different personalities. When you particularly add advice or give suggestions or kind of guide a particular person based on their suggestive function, they actually appreciate that kind of advice. Okay. But if you do it in the sense of the mobilizing, it's a little more defensive, and especially in the sense of the vulnerable function, you'll see a kind of a different reaction. And like I said, I'm making very global statements, and it's not my goal to make global statements. There's always variations. No model is perfect. Okay. And so the idea is to understand that aspect. And the idea is to understand how these particular things work together and how they don't work, and understanding that both are separate. And if you try to cross over, you're just going to go in these really crazy loops like I did for a while. So the truth is, and I'm looking at the comments at the same time, so I'm slowing down just a little bit because I'm going 90 miles per hour. Okay, so are there the same amount of socionic combinations as MBTI? Yes, there's 16, but there's also subtypes. And then even below, there's 4 levels of subtypes. So it goes down into way more than 32 different types. I think that's a little overcomplicated. Subtype is about as far as I really care to go. I think any more than that, you're just going too far down a rabbit hole. It's like, well, why is your fingernail shorter than the next person? I think that's a little too specific. And when you start getting that refined in a model, you're leaving a lot more room for error. And so I think it's good to stay a little bit general and to understand how it works. And it has a little more applicability in the outer world and understanding in which the theory is defined. So let's see if I have any more questions before I move on to anything else before I rant on here. So do we know what Jung's original interpretation of the cognitive functions were? Were they more in line with modern day MBTI definitions or more akin to information elements? Justin, I don't know. That's a good question. It gets messy because the problem is that Jung had a very specific application for his description of the functions and the cognitive functions. He had an application. He wanted to use it in his practice, and he wanted to use it. So he left the descriptions a little vague, I think. And so that's why there's no clear distinction of this is what he said. There are things he did say, obviously, in psychological types, right? And it's not super clear. I think that the primary advantage of MBTI is like an icebreaker to cognitive function theory. It has a lot of applicability. I think the dichotomies of E versus I and S versus N and T versus F and J versus P is a great tool for organizations. It's a great tool for many, many people. I think the problem is that we've tried to take it to a level in which it's defective. We tend to want to utilize a lot of, I call this fetishizing, but a lot of people take a particular system and they try to apply it to everything. It's like, I love MBTI, so I MBTI type my cat, I MBTI type my desk, I MBTI type everything that I can possibly type. And there's a point where it's like, this is human psychology. Why are you typing your freaking cat? Right? And there's a point where it just gets into this mess. And that's what I'm trying to avoid is, and I've said this on many live streams, is let's keep the system and use it for what it's good for. If you understand go ahead.
Yeah, man, if you want to like type your cat with MBTI, why don't you just create your own, functions for cats? They behave so much more differently than humans. Yeah, that's what I'm.
All right, so I think there's a question here. It's what is MBTI trying to look at versus Socionics, or are they attempting to look at the same thing? MBTI is about the dichotomies more than anything. And this is what gives MBTI its high rankings, is because the dichotomies actually make sense. You can actually physically see the dichotomies. So you can physically see the dichotomies in people's personalities. A lot of INFPs, or people who typed in MBTI as INFPs, would probably wind up more INFJ-ish, ENFJ-ish, ENFP-ish in Socionics. All right. So the idea is understanding that, because that perceiving function, for example, people I have typed as INFJs is because I have found that their J function, the J dichotomy, is actually not very strong most of the time. Generally, the INFJ, as we know them, with dominant NI, is kind of removed from reality in general. So this makes them not really motivated to push forward, right? So you're not going to see a lot of that J. So they'll type as INFP and MBTI, and they're like, I'm so confused. I don't know what I am. And it's because you don't align with FI very well. You're like, that's not me. But at the same time, you're like, well, I'm not a J, so what am I? And that's what creates the problem. But if you look at the dichotomy and you just understand dichotomy, because even when I was training in MBTI, I saw this quite a bit. It's like you could see it was like everything was very, when it came to the dichotomies, everything was like very specific. This is the dichotomy. This is how it works. Here's how you test for it. Here's a blah, blah, blah. Here's what's the questions you ask. And then when it goes to theory, oh yeah, that's the chapter on theory. And kind of like cognitive theory, it's cool, right? Let's move past it. And that's it. It wasn't really specific. And it's because there's a lot of argumentation in MBTI as far as that goes. Yeah, I know. I imitate and mock people. I'm sorry. I got to do it. So the key is to understand that aspect, which is, MBTI has never put a lot of emphasis on the cognitive functions. Excuse me. And as they moved on, they've got other psychological tests out there, like Big Five. Big Five is a good example. When you see Big Five, you see that they put things on a sliding scale, right? And you have like extroversion and introversion. And you're like a 1 here or a 2 here, or whatever. And you start seeing that. And then that's what creates a lot of problem, because that's kind of influenced the psychological industry, because the Big Five is much more appreciated, right? So now MBTI has put more emphasis on their particular aspect of dichotomies versus going into cognitive functions, because cognitive functions don't exist. Do they? Do they not? We don't know. No, they can't be proven. Whereas you can definitely measure someone's J, like attitude. But as well as I know, that FJs are not like TJs when their J aspect is being used. FJs are generally less scheduled. Not always, but the case. They're generally less scheduled. But they're J's still. So they might type as FPs. Right? And whereas you see the TJs, highly scheduled, structure, this and this order, these are the things I got to get done. So you get this really big mishmash of ideas, and you get this big mix up. And what is actually being done about this is that MBTI is moving away from cognitive function theory, as far as I can tell. They'll always have it, because that's kind of where it was founded on. But the issue is they just didn't. It's not valued by the psychological community because it's Jungian, okay, and that's one of the primary reasons why. Where Socionics, it's not really. It is the study of the information metabolism, so it has that aspect. So what I'm encouraging here, and kind of the take-home point, is to understand how to use these systems in your daily life, and to study both of them, because they both have value. It's not like one or the other is better. Stop comparing. One sucks, one doesn't. I hate MBTI now because Socionics has it all. No, that's not the case. They all have their perspective. The thing I don't like about MBTI, when it's not even about MBTI, it's the public's perception of MBTI, is the stereotypes that were created because the generalized concepts. MBTI is great Yes, Leo. Damon. Leo says, Damon, I was thinking, doesn't what you said earlier contradict your video on INFP, INFJ mistyping? What the hell? Yes, it does. I contradict myself a lot because I'm always learning, Leo. So there's always more to teach, and so there's the road of information is constant, but I keep an open mind, and I always am happy to admit when I'm incorrect. But I'll tell you the one thing about that video that I still stand by the cognitive function standpoint. But you got to remember that that when it comes to cognitive functions, they are vastly different. But again, MBTI types on dichotomies. Okay, so that's the big thing. MBTI types on dichotomies. So this is where the confusion part is. But if you start understanding the functions, it's pretty clear. You're like, huh, you're a J, but you're not a J. Okay, that's fine, Leo. I know you're not. I'm fine with that. Like I said, I wouldn't even have read it if I felt like you were trying to take away my credibility. I mean, honestly, I'm a student. I'm always a student. I'll always be a student. So it's not like I feel like you're trying to take my credibility away or anything. Yeah, and so it does get pretty messed up when you start looking at these things. But again, I'll tell you, after a certain point, you start looking at MBTI and go, okay, what's beyond the dichotomies? You're going to naturally move into functions. And when you move into functions, you can start seeing that you may type as an INFP, but you're actually INFJ. And I've done this many times in my my step 2s and my step 1s administering the MBTI tool, is when we get down to it, at the end, if they're still confused on not relating to FI, I have to filter out the J versus P aspect. And I have to go, okay, you might not be a J, you might not be a P, and we need to look at the functions. I use the functions as a backup tool if they're unable to distinguish which particular dichotomy they fall under. And then we have to we have to walk through it. And this is where the confusion really arises. And this is where a lot of people are kind of mixed up in the process. So I just want you guys to understand that aspect. There's a lot more to it, and it's just another tool to help you understand your psychology, just like Enneagram. It's not like one is better or worse. You don't go, oh, I'm MBTI, I hate Enneagram. You just see value in it. Dario Nardi's research is primarily off the MBTI descriptions, which are great. I mean, I don't, like I said, I'm not denying that the MBTI descriptions are not the functions. But when you're speaking with other people on Slack, or wherever it is, you got to make sure you have it clarified. Are you talking about SE, the cognitive function, or are you talking about SE, the information element? Otherwise, you're bound to have a big disagreement on what it is. And this has caused a lot of confusion on our particular MBTV Slack chat because of people trying to define a particular thing. I will say that I don't know if it's me or if it's just because, Socionics is easier, but understanding the information elements came a lot quicker as far as Socionics goes. It just came much quicker than my study of MBTI. And it could be just me because I obviously have a lot of training in MBTI, so it kind of came very quickly to understand the information elements in Socionics. Even though they're vastly different, you start knowing naturally how your brain processes information. And you start getting this understanding, okay, they are different in this regard. And so, so Leo, just to cap that off, yeah, you're 100% correct. There can be a contradiction in my earlier videos, and there always is. I mean, you can go back and you can filter out the particular aspect of, well, you said this 5 years ago. Yeah, I did, and I was wrong. There's plenty of that. And like I said, I don't mind. I like to be clear, and I like to clarify that, as we move forward, we do come across new information. And it's always a good thing once you recognize that. You start seeing, okay, there's more to it than what I'd originally thought. So no, Leo, I didn't take offense, and I appreciate you calling out just for clarification, and I'm glad to give that clarity. So let's see if we have any more questions before I start winding this up for the end. And Blake, do you want to add anything? Was that a no? You're good?
Yeah, dude.
Okay. So, all right. So that being said, let's see if there's any questions here. So guys, ask your questions if you got any. So if you don't have any, then okay. So Evermind, how mature is the process in typing someone in Socionics? I would say it's much cleaner. It's much cleaner. There's a lot of socionists out there who type people. Jack does it. Not that I want everybody just to pursue Jack and obviously get, fill up his entire schedule. I don't know what his cost is and all that, but I do know that I think it's much clearer. I think it has a lot more clarity as far as information metabolism, because you can pretty much, like I said in MBTI, you can't cognitively look at someone's MBTI type and know what their preferences are. But in Socionics, you can actually see how information is metabolized. It's much more clear. And so this is where I sound contradictory when I say you can probably guess people's types on Socionics a lot easier than you could in MBTI. So there is that outside observation, which is much more appreciated in Socionics. They've went as far as going with VI, which is visual identification, and recognizing people by their facial structures. Jack doesn't endorse VI. I think it's a great tool, but I don't think it's like the say all. Obviously, if they say, well, ESFJs or ESEs are very thin. What if the ESE gets fed a lot of food? What if he turns fat? Now what? Is he no longer ESE? So there's too many variables for VI, but they went as far as going with VI and facial expressions and all that. And I think that does play a role. Because I mean, your brain ultimately is wired to your physiology in some way or another. But I don't think there is no source that says it's 100% accurate. There is still always that room for error. And pretty much most sources say they've never been officially added to Socionics because it leaves, there's too much room for error when you're looking at someone's visual identification. Now there's people out there who claim they're experts at it, which is great, but I wouldn't count on just someone using VI to type you. I think it's important to witness how you process information, how you perceive things. Your Enneagram type also Your Enneagram type also correlates pretty well with Socionics. So you'll start seeing some of the pairing with Socionics as far as Enneagram too. And I've seen a lot of pairing in myself. So I think there's that correlation as well. So I do not do Socionics typing. Like I said, I'm very new to Socionics. I can start seeing the same patterns in Socionics, and I like to look at things and start seeing if I can type based on that. But no, I don't do Socionics typings. I mean, I can try. I'd be happy to try, but I don't give myself enough credit to be able to type professionally. So at least not at this point. Maybe some road down the future, sure. But I just wanted to educate you guys on some of the differences and maybe troubles you have translating from one system to another, and making sure that you're not going down the wrong road and then getting mixed up and going, well, SE is this and SE is this, force is this and SE is not force, and this confusion. So it can all be avoided. Just start from scratch on Socionics, and then it makes the transition a lot easier. All right, any last questions? I will pause it for a second, and if there's any last questions, I'll answer them. Otherwise, I will start ending this call. So. Okay, well, I don't see anything. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, Lady Lowball, you're right. She said that you'll probably need to keep repeating this SE versus SI stuff and TE versus TI. I'm not saying it's a direct translation. I'm repeating myself not because you don't understand that, but again, it's not that TE goes directly to TI in Socionics. That's not the case either. They're different, and it's very hard to be able to make that transition. But yeah, I will keep stressing this in my video over and over again, so that way it's clear. And if you join the Slack chat, you'll probably get a lot of my snippets. I like to kind of work my thoughts out with people on Slack, and you might be a lucky recipient. Brian is one of my people that I do that with. He sees me go back and forth and wish-wash on my particular opinions. I think Jack is another person that I do that. I like to bounce ideas off of him as well and go back and forth. So, all right, guys, if you have any questions, jump on Slack. If you haven't done it, get on there. It's important that you do. We want to obviously add you to our little community and get the chance to talk with you as well. So hopefully you guys have the opportunity to check it out. It's mbtv-chat.signup.team, and you can do that. So you can go from there. Derek, yes, I have. I'm a fan of Michael Castillo. He has much more of the MBTI understanding of the functions versus the Socionics understanding. That's how he describes them anyway. So so I appreciate that. And yes, Leo, you're right. I do have very little patience on typing. I much prefer to talk with my camera like I am right now. And knowing that you guys are watching helps because I'm talking to people even though I can't interact with you as well. So, right, exactly. Yeah, and that too. And yeah, so Leo, it's due to the fact that I am allowed to form my thoughts without that interruption. And also, I hate text. I'm known to ignore text. I just do. I don't like it. I want to talk. Anyway, hope you guys had a great night, and I appreciate you guys so much. And we'll have the live stream on Sunday as normal. Just wanted to keep you in the loop. And if there's any further questions, hop on Slack. Talk to you soon.